Alright, so I got a bunch of these smaller pieces of marble. I thought I'd be able to more quickly do testing with the smaller pieces. I took some of my 12 mil adhesive back vinyl and I made a new stencil of Miss Maggie, and up in my sandblast cabinet I vacuumed out all of the grit that I had in there, which was a little bit more like in the 60 grit range, and put in a bunch of 180 aluminum oxide. I still have the same 3/16 tip on my gun, but I got a 1/8 tip coming. And I did have, when I obviously got the centers, when I had to move them from the stencil to the transfer tape, some of them were loose. I had to reposition them. But once I put this down onto the marble and pressed it in good and did the sandblasting, they all seem to hold in place. And I made several passes, and I can just tell by the shadowing that it's a pretty good deep cut. I could probably have gone deeper, but let's take this off, this stencil off, and see what it looks like underneath. Well, this was pretty impressive. Look how sharp these lines are. Even the little centers never moved. They were actually a little hard to take off when I took the stencil off. So this is the breakthrough. Alright, I think I'm going to try to paint it like this, but then I'm going to do another one, and I'm going to leave the stencil on after the sandblasting and paint it that way. So then I'll have those two to compare it to. And I did 2 coats and then one final wet coat. And now I'm going to try another one, and then we'll leave the mask on, the stencil on, when we paint it afterwards. Well, we're getting our first couple inches up here, so it's a good thing to come in and do some sandblasting. Now, as I mentioned, I cleaned out the black diamond grit that I had in there, and then I filled the hopper up down there with maybe about 4 cups of the 180 aluminum oxide. And then I got the pressure. It's going to run at about 75 psi, and we'll give it a go. Alright, that sandblasting went well. Now that I still got the stencil on it, we're going to paint it. Alright, so this is the version where I painted the whole thing, and therefore I had to take off paint from the surface that wasn't down inside of the lettering. That took a little bit of work. I ended up having to use wet dry sandpaper on a very flat metal sanding block that I have, and it took about 10 minutes to get all of that nice and clean. There's a little remnant of that in some of them, so it also took away a little bit of what was in some of the letters. The more important problem is, you see an example here where the rock itself had some dents in it, or indentations, which is natural in natural stone, where the paint also went in, that I had to dig that out with a X-Acto knife and even a little bit of solvent in some of the cases, like that one here, that there, that there. Whereas if you, that's something that you don't have as a problem with the one with the stencil still attached. But still turned out okay. It's nice and deep, and the paint seems to be pretty well placed. But now let's go to the good one. This was the one where I had the stencil on for the sandblasting. I dusted it off, then I applied one light coat, and then a second coat, and then a wet coat with that stencil on. Let it completely dry, and then just pulled it off, and this is how nice it came out. I can't believe how nice and clean it is. So the trick was to use that it's actually 180 grit aluminum oxide media in my sandblast cabinet, and I had the pressure about 75 psi. You probably could go a little bit lower on that if you wanted to do that. And at least into this marble, it cut really nicely. And that stencil material that I mentioned, the 12 mil self-adhesive, seemed to be the trick. Alright, thanks for watching.